Thank you for listening in on this chamber conversation. I'm Mark Nigbor, the immediate past chair for the St. John's Chamber of Commerce. Today, we'll be discussing what you need to consider as we bring remote workers back to our places of business. Joining our conversation are two chamber members who have graciously offered their time and expertise. Gary Wheeler, a partner with Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Prophete, who specializes in labor law, and Rusty Bozman, founder of the workplace Synergistics, a talent optimization company. Rusty's also a certified select planner with the Predictive Index. Before we get started with the questions, I would like to review with you some of the latest information coming out of the CDC. Let's start with what you can do once you've been fully vaccinated. What they are recommending and is allowable is to visit in a home or a private setting without a mask, so long as you're with other fully vaccinated people of any age. You can now travel domestically with or without a pre or post COVID test, and you don't need to quarantine after travel. As it relates to international, the pre-test, pre-COVID test may depend on the destination you are headed to. And also the same thing applies with international not requiring quarantine after travel. What is still not recommended is to visit indoors without a mask with people at increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19, or attend medium or large gatherings. While this is the latest to cover many of the situations for the general public, I would like to direct you to the section on the CDC website for workplaces and businesses to obtain additional guidance and information. This link will also be provided as part of our presentation. Now let's get started with the questions. Gary, we'll start one with you. Can an employer require an employee to come back to work? And what accommodations need to be in place for a safe work environment?
Good question. Yes, ultimately, an employer can require employees to come back to work. The classic setting that kind of comes to my mind when I think about that is employers that have had some or all of their workforce working from home and has now decided that it wants to bring either all or some segment of its employees back into the workplace. And it can certainly has that as a business judgment. There's no law prohibiting them from doing that, certainly not in Florida. So, a couple of things to keep in mind, though, is just because something is legally allowable doesn't mean it's always in your best interest as an employer to just to do something immediately. So, we suggest that employers consider some substantial lead time in to notify employees of the requirement that they come into work. And then the second part of your question has to do with accommodations. Accommodations are really something that you deal with on a case-by-case basis, but you do need to, set up a system that anticipates that you will be asked to make accommodations and that you need to consider those. You need to go through what's called the interactive process, where you ask questions and elicit information from the employee about their concerns, and make and then react to those in an appropriate way. Just to get kind of the bottom line is ultimately a generalized anxiety about coming back to work and being concerned about getting coronavirus. For the most part, is not going to be something that rises to the level of a disability that would require the employer to accommodate that employee and just say, okay, well, then just work from home until you're comfortable. That's probably not going to be something that's going to, but an employer should be open to having a conversation and seeing if there's something more specific with regard to that employee and potentially involving a healthcare provider. Generally, it's helpful when you're having a discussion about something like this, a health-related topic, to get a healthcare provider involved. And one of the ways that you could do that is provide information, usually in the form of a form letter that says, hey, your patient and our employee has expressed concerns about this. And then you insert some context into that communication to the healthcare provider. And then you send a form that asks a series of questions that is designed to provide you information about some kind of impairment that employee may have, and what accommodations, workplace accommodations, may be appropriate for you to consider. Ultimately, it's the employer's decision to decide whether or not to make those accommodations or not. But it's an education process between the employer and the employee, and usually getting input from a healthcare provider is going to be important. So yes, ultimately, employers can require employees to come back. But the most important thing to do in this process is to have good lead time and a system that allows this interactive process of discussing potential accommodations to take place.
So as a follow-up on that, Gary, can an employer force an employee to be vaccinated as a condition of coming back to work? And is vaccination information protected by HIPAA laws?
Yeah, this is another great example of what an employer can do legally and what, maybe what it should do. Ultimately, subject to a few fairly narrow exceptions, an employer could require an employee or all of its employees to be vaccinated unless they say, okay, well, I can't be vaccinated because I some kind of disabling condition or some kind of medical condition, including if an employee's pregnant, or they may have some kind of, potential reaction to the ingredients of a vaccine that would preclude them from being safely vaccinated. But those are fairly narrow. So an employer could possibly require that. Now, whether that they should or not is a different question. First, let's just say an employer decides they want to do it. There are some considerations to take into place about how they do it. Number one is employers are encouraged to engage a third party to administer the vaccines. So, maybe the employer has nurses who are capable of administering vaccines, and we've seen this before. You can potentially acquire some vaccines and administer vaccines on your own. That's probably a rare case, but one of the downsides to doing that is while asking an employee whether or not he or she has been vaccinated and asking the employee to provide a receipt for demonstrating that they're vaccinated is not something that violates the Americans with Disability Act privacy laws. To safely administer a vaccine, you have to ask a series of questions that could implicate privacy laws. So you become, you actually are gaining too much information that you probably don't want or need by asking the employee about his or her health history. So that's why if you just ultimately decide to do it, we suggest that you involve a third party like a pharmacy or, one of these mass sites that are administering the vaccine, and then just requiring a receipt of some kind. And again, you'll also want to engage in an interactive process to make reasonable accommodations to an employee that has either some kind of medical condition that might make getting a vaccine more dangerous than not getting one. And then also some kind of a religious accommodations that might be possible. And there are some other things to consider about, hey, are we going to, even if we mandate it and have these narrow exceptions, is it really a good idea? And just some of the things to consider about why it may not be a good idea is, remember that the COVID vaccines were fast tracked. That doesn't mean they're not safe. It just means that they are on a fast track and their effectiveness is, certainly in the long term is still somewhat up in the air. And think of the downside. If an employer requires an employee to get a vaccination and one or more employees has a bad reaction to it, could the employer be liable for that bad reaction? Well, we don't know, but you're certainly putting a target on your back and inviting a claim more if you are going to step in and require vaccinations, and an employee's unaware of, their predisposition to some kind of adverse reaction and they have one and they blame it on their employer. They basically say, I wouldn't have had one, but I didn't want to lose my job. So, and then, finally, there's another one is like some employers are offering, are not requiring vaccines, but are giving employees incentives to get vaccinated. And somewhere along that line, you become from giving an incentive to it becomes a mandate, because if the difference between whether you get the vaccine or not affects you so significantly, the law might consider that to be a mandated vaccine. So unfortunately, there's no guidance out yet on that, but we expect some soon about what employer incentives cross the line and become essentially mandated requirements. So anyway, those are some things to consider about whether you can mandate vaccinations, which ultimately you can, subject to some narrow exceptions, but it may not necessarily be in employer's best interest given these other things we've discussed.
Thank you, Gary. I got a question for you, Rusty. How do we provide flexibility for remote working requests while still being fair and consistent for all of our workers?
Well, thank you for the question and thank you for having me today. One of the things that I'm finding with my clients is that they find themselves having to sort of thread the needle with balancing the needs of individual rights and liberties with the needs to provide healthy and safe working environments for everybody else. And so I think a lot of the things Gary talked about are really important, particularly thinking about things up front before you actually set anything into motion. I've been advising clients to set up and communicate a standard. So if you are deciding how you want to handle the return to work, 70% roughly of employees would like to remain in a hybrid environment. So maybe that's 2-3 days a week in the office, 1 to 2 days or 3 days not in the office. It really depends on the nature of the work. It depends on the sort of culture of the organization and the particular feelings from the leadership. But I think understanding what we're going to do and how we're going to do it on the front end really is going to go a long way towards setting up that policy. And once you kind of have that, then I think we need to figure out what roles would be eligible to work from home if we want to continue to do that, and then communicate and create clear expectations for each role and each team up front. I usually advise that we keep any conditions or rules as job related as possible and remain very committed toward consistency in how we apply that. The big problem that I see is the issue of COVID is a polarizing issue. I wish it wasn't, but I think it is. And different people have different feelings about it. Some people feel very strongly that it's not a big deal, and some people feel very strongly that it is. And so when you're bringing people back, I think it's important to just keep in mind that you have lots of different opinions that you're trying to balance. And so having, like I said, a consistent policy on the front end is going to go a long way. And the policy ought to outline when a remote employee is expected to be available. In other words, what kind of standard office workday are you guys looking to have? And then what are the different types of technology that you might need if you're going to remain remote, things like that. Some of my clients are considering staggered work days where they would have one group come in on one day and another group come in on another day, just to sort of mitigate the number of people in the office at the same time. They might do that with shifts. In terms of having meetings, they might still have meetings in person, but use larger rooms where they can space. So really lots of different things to consider. You want to make sure, though, if you are going to entertain requests for employees to remain or to go to remote work, that you want to make sure that you've outlined when an employee can request to work remote, and then how would they make that request, and then ultimately who reviews and approves those requests. And of course, you want to be as consistent as possible. The one challenge, of course, is that if you don't find that right balance and don't use objective measures to make those calls, you could alienate a large population of your employee base. And, you know, they could either become upset enough to quit and leave, or worse, upset enough to quit and stay. And so ultimately, I think, you know, this is a tough situation because we don't really have any national standards or even state level standards, and every company's trying to do this on their own. So, you know, I'd encourage you to find someone like Gary to help you walk through this.
Thank you, Rusty. And also to both of you, Gary and Rusty, thank you for your time and helping our members with these issues discussed on this chamber conversation. And to the members, stay tuned to future chamber conversations to help you as you navigate, as Rusty said, these challenging times. Thank you, everyone, and be safe.